With nothing but a flooded basement and mounting debts, Henry Dawson reluctantly accepts an inheritance that 3 decades of estrangement from his father made him consider refusing. Mocked by his successful brothers for choosing the worthless property over cash, Henry makes one final desperate attempt to salvage something by breaking through a mysterious sealed wall. What he doesn't realize is that beneath his father's modest home lies not just a bunker, but a hidden Nazi command center containing $180 million in stolen art and gold bullion, and evidence of a wartime conspiracy that would shake the foundations of his hometown's most respected family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain had been relentless for 6 straight days, turning the already dismal basement of Gerald Dawson's modest suburban home into what resembled an underground lake more than a storage space. Water stains crept steadily up the concrete walls, marking the rise and fall of flooding over decades like geological layers chronicling Earth's history. The musty smell of mildew permeated everything, a tangible reminder of years of neglect. Henry Dawson stood at the bottom of the creaking wooden stairs, his work boots already submerged in 3 inches of murky water. At 47, his weathered face had settled into permanent lines of disappointment, his once broad shoulders now slightly stooped from years of carrying both physical loads as a contractor and the emotional weight of being the family disappointment. Thunder rumbled outside, nature's mocking laughter echoing his brother's derision from the reading of their father's will just hours earlier. "Dad always did have a weird sense of humor," Michael had said, the eldest brother's voice dripping with the same condescension that had characterized their relationship since childhood. "Leaving the golden boy the flooded money pit while we get the investment portfolio." Thomas, the middle brother, had at least attempted to hide his amusement, though the slight curl of his lip betrayed his true feelings. Maybe it's because Henry's the only one who knows which end of a hammer to hold, he'd offered, not unkindly but with the casual dismissiveness that stung nonetheless. Henry flicked on his industrial flashlight, its beam cutting through the basement's shadows and reflecting off the water's surface in distorted patterns. His father's final words in the will had been cryptic. "To Henry, I leave the house and everything beneath it. He alone will understand its true value." "Not much value in a flooded basement, Dad," Henry muttered to the empty room, his voice echoing slightly off the damp walls. The family dog Max, a loyal German shepherd mix with graying muzzle, whined softly from the top of the stairs, unwilling to join his master in the water below. The inheritance had come as a shock to everyone. Gerald Dawson and his youngest son had barely spoken in 30 years, their relationship fractured by differences that seemed insurmountable. Henry had rejected the family's banking tradition, choosing instead to work with his hands, building things rather than financing them. His father had never forgiven what he saw as a betrayal of the Dawson legacy, and Henry had never sought forgiveness for following his own path. Yet here he stood, the reluctant heir to a house he'd avoided for decades and a basement that seemed determined to return to its natural state as a swamp. The property was worth something. Millfield had become a desirable suburb over the years, but the necessary repairs would eat away most of that value. The bank had already called about his father's reverse mortgage, the balance due in full within 90 days. "Well, Max," Henry called up to the dog, "we'd better see what we're dealing with." He waded deeper into the basement, the beam of his flashlight revealing shelves of waterlogged boxes, old furniture draped in plastic sheeting, and the usual detritus of a life long lived. Nothing valuable, nothing remarkable, until the light caught something unusual on the far wall. Unlike the other 3 walls of poured concrete, typical of homes built in the 1950s, the back wall appeared different, more deliberate in its construction, with bricks arranged in an unusual pattern. More striking was the fact that while water damage marked the other walls up to 4 feet high, This wall remained oddly dry above the current water level, as though sealed with something more effective than standard mortar. Henry moved closer, curiosity temporarily overriding his resentment. The brickwork was expert professional with tight, precise joints that had weathered decades underground with minimal deterioration. In the center, almost imperceptible unless you were looking for it, was a slight variation in the pattern. A square about 3 feet across where the bricks aligned differently. "What were you hiding, old man?" Henry murmured, reaching out to touch the unusual section. The sound of tires on wet gravel announced a visitor. Henry turned, sloshing through the water toward the stairs. Through the small basement windows, he could see an expensive black Mercedes sedan parking beside his weathered pickup truck. Thomas had arrived, no doubt to survey his brother's consolation prize and offer unwanted advice about selling quickly. "Down here," Henry called as he heard the front door open and his brother's distinctive footsteps across the hardwood floor above. Thomas appeared at the top of the stairs, immaculate in a tailored suit despite the gloomy weather, his expression a practiced mask of sympathetic concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just thought I'd check in, see how you're handling all this." His gaze swept dismissively over the flooded space. "I'm fine, Thomas," Henry replied, climbing the stairs. "Just assessing the damage. Preparing and narrating this story. Took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "Damage is right," Thomas agreed, stepping back to allow his brother into the main floor. "Michael and I were talking. We're willing to help you unload this place. There's a developer who might take it as is, save you the headache of repairs." Henry felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same constriction that had accompanied every interaction with his brothers since childhood. The assumption that he couldn't handle things himself, that he needed their superior wisdom and connections. "I'll manage," he said simply. Thomas shrugged, the gesture somehow conveying both indifference and disapproval. "Suit yourself. But that basement will need professional remediation." The Morgensterns down the street had similar flooding last year, cost them $40,000 to fix properly. Henry knew his brother was right, which only made the advice more irritating. The house needed work he couldn't afford, to address problems he hadn't created, because of an inheritance he hadn't sought. "Was there something specific you needed, Thomas?" Henry asked, not bothering to hide his impatience. "Actually, yes. Father's attorney mentioned some family documents in the house historical records, that sort of thing. Mother's been asking about them." Thomas glanced around the cluttered living room. Any idea where he might have kept them? "None," Henry answered truthfully. "I haven't been in this house in decades, remember?" Thomas nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Yes, well, that was unfortunate. For both of you." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a business card. "This is Sandra Fletcher's contact information. She's the best real estate agent in Millfield. When you're ready to sell, and you will be, give her a call." After Thomas left, Henry stood in the silent house, the card still in his hand. Max nudged his leg, seeking attention or perhaps offering comfort. The house creaked and settled. Around them, the sounds of an unfamiliar structure adjusting to new occupants. That evening, after spending hours pumping water from the basement with a rented industrial pump, Henry sat at his father's kitchen table reviewing his options. House itself was structurally sound despite the basement issues: 3 bedrooms, decent yard, good neighborhood. In the current market, properly renovated, it might fetch enough to pay off the reverse mortgage and leave a modest sum. Not life-changing money, but something. As he sorted through his father's papers, Henry discovered an old leather-bound journal, tucked in the back of a desk drawer. The binding was cracked with age, the pages yellowed but well preserved. Inside, in his father's meticulous handwriting, were entries dating back to 1975, the year Gerald Dawson had purchased the house, April 17, 1975. Closed on the Millfield property today. Lorraine thinks I'm crazy for buying a house with such obvious problems, but she doesn't understand. William Weber practically gave it away after his father's death, eager to be rid of it. If he knew what lies beneath, he never would have sold. Henry straightened in his chair, suddenly alert. He flipped forward several pages. June 23, 1975. Started preliminary exploration of the basement today while Lorraine was visiting her sister. The wall is exactly as described in Ernst's letter. Will need specialized tools to proceed without causing structural damage. The neighbors are too close for comfort. Must be cautious and patient. August 9, 1975. Breakthrough. The antechamber is intact, just as Ernst documented. Only ventured a few feet in the air is stale but breathable. Sealed everything back. Up before Lorraine returned. Need better lighting and equipment before proceeding further. The Morgenstern boy was watching from their yard today. Must be more careful. The entries continued sporadically over several years, each more cryptic than the last. References to the chamber, Ernst's documentation, and securing the entrance peppered the journal, but concrete details were frustratingly absent. The final entry was dated just 2 years ago, November 4, 2023. Doctor gave me 6 months. Not enough time to finish what I started all those years ago. Henry is the only one who might understand, who might complete the work. Michael and Thomas are too embedded in the system, too concerned with appearances and position. It must be Henry, though he'll never forgive me for what I've done. Perhaps that's for the best. Unforgiveness keeps a man sharp, keeps him questioning. The truth beneath this house will test even him. Henry closed the journal, his mind racing. What truth? What chamber? His father had always been stern, sometimes difficult, but never delusional. If Gerald Dawson had been exploring something hidden in the basement, it wasn't fantasy, it was something tangible. Something worth decades of secrecy. Henry's gaze drifted to the basement door. The strange brick wall. The unusual pattern. His father's final words echoed in his mind. To Henry, I leave the house and everything beneath it. He alone will understand its true value. The next morning, Henry returned to the basement with renewed purpose. The industrial pump had removed most of the standing water, though the concrete floor remained slick and damp. He approached the brick wall again, examining it with fresh eyes and the context of his father's journal. This time, he noticed additional details, small marks chiseled into certain bricks that formed a subtle pattern, almost like coordinates. The central section he'd observed earlier now seemed obvious, a disguised door or access panel. But how? To open it? Henry spent the morning carefully examining every inch of the wall, occasionally referring back to the journal for clues. His father had mentioned specialized tools, but gave no indication what kind. Around noon, as frustration began to mount, Henry's hand passed over a seemingly ordinary brick near the floor and felt it shift slightly under pressure. Kneeling in the damp, Henry pressed the brick firmly. With a soft grinding sound, it receded into the wall about an inch, then stopped. Nothing else happened. That can't be it, he muttered, sitting back on his heels. Max, who had finally ventured into the basement to join him, sniffed curiously at the recessed brick. Henry stood, considering the wall again. If one brick moved, perhaps others did as well. Methodically, he began testing bricks that aligned with the marks he'd observed earlier. The third one he tried, about shoulder height, also recessed into the wall when firmly pressed. A pattern was emerging. Henry identified and pressed 2 more movable bricks, each corresponding to the subtle marks he'd noticed. After the 5th brick recessed, a muffled click emanated from within the wall, and the central section shifted almost imperceptibly, receding about half an inch. Henry's heart raced as he placed his fingertips along the edge of the now visible seam and pulled gently. The section of wall, a disguised door, roughly 3 feet square, swung outward with surprising ease, revealing a small antechamber beyond. The space was perhaps 6 feet deep and 8 feet wide, with a concrete floor and walls. Metal shelving lined one side, holding dusty boxes and what appeared to be old equipment. On the opposite wall was a much more substantial door steel, with a heavy wheel handle like something from a submarine or bank vault. Henry stepped into the antechamber, his flashlight beam playing over the contents of the shelves. Most of the boxes contained papers in German, technical diagrams and maps. The equipment included several antique Leica cameras, light meters, and what looked like surveying tools. Everything was meticulously organized and labeled in the same precise handwriting as his father's journal. The steel door dominated the small space, its presence raising more questions than answers. Why would a suburban home built in the 1950s contain a bank vault door hidden behind a false wall? What could possibly warrant such security? Henry approached the door, examining the wheel mechanism. It was well maintained, with no visible rust, despite decades underground. Tentatively, he gripped the wheel and attempted to turn it. It resisted at first, then yielded to steady pressure, rotating with a series of audible clicks. As the locking mechanism disengaged, Henry became aware of a sound from outside car doors closing, voices approaching the house. He froze, listening. His brothers' voices were unmistakable, along with a third he didn't recognize. "The developer's very interested, but we need to move quickly," the stranger was saying as they entered the house above. Henry's stubborn but practical, came Michael's voice. "Once he sees the figures, he'll understand this is the sensible option." Henry quietly stepped back into the main basement area, pulling the brick door closed behind him. It settled back into place with barely a sound, the disguised entrance once again invisible to casual observation. He hurried up the stairs, not wanting to be caught in the flooded basement like a trespasser in the home he now owned. Michael Thomas and a sharp-featured man in expensive suits stood in the living room, examining the space with the calculating eyes of developers seeing potential profit rather than a family home. "Henry," Michael greeted him with obviously forced warmth. "This is Victor Morgenstern from Millfield Development Group. He's prepared to make a very generous offer for the property." "As is," Victor stepped forward, hand extended. "Mr. Dawson, I knew your father not well, but we served on several community boards together. He was a man of principle." Henry shook the offered hand automatically, his mind still processing what he'd discovered below. He had his own principles, certainly. "The offer is simple," Victor continued, producing a document folder from his briefcase. 50% over market value for comparable properties in the area, no inspections required, cash transaction. We would assume all responsibility for the basement water issues and any other repairs. It was, objectively, an excellent offer, far better than Henry could hope to get through conventional channels. If his only concern had been financial, he would have accepted immediately. But the hidden chamber and his father's cryptic journal had changed the equation dramatically. "I need time to consider," Henry said, not reaching for the folder. "I've only owned the house for 2 days." Michael's expression tightened with impatience. "Henry, be reasonable. This is a gift away out of a money pit that will only drain whatever resources you have. The basement alone will cost." "I'm aware of the challenges," Henry interrupted. "And I appreciate the offer, but I'm not making decisions today." Victor Morgenstern studied Henry with unexpected intensity, his previously cordial expression hardening almost imperceptibly. "The offer has a 24-hour expiration. Mr. Dawson, my company has multiple projects underway in Millfield, and we operate on tight schedules." The pressure tactic only strengthened Henry's resolve. "Then I'll have an answer for you tomorrow." After they left, Henry returned to the kitchen and opened his father's journal again, searching for any mention of the Morgenstern family. Found several scattered references, none detailed, but all suggesting some connection between the families that went beyond mere neighbors. December 12, 1978, Richard Morgenstern continues to inquire about structural issues with my basement. His questions are too specific, too probing. He knows something, or suspects. His father was part of the occupation administration. He might have access to records thought destroyed. January 30th, 1979. Confrontation with Morgenstern today. He offered to take the property off my hands at a generous price. When I refused, the threat was thinly veiled. Mentioned building code violations that could be overlooked with proper cooperation. Must accelerate the documentation process before he finds another angle of attack. The implications were disturbing. Whatever lay behind that steel door, the Morgenstern family had been trying to acquire it for at least 45 years. The pressure hadn't relented with Richard's son Victor, now making essentially the same offer his father had decades ago. Henry called the only person he thought might help make sense of the situation. Rachel Winters had been his closest friend since high school, a brilliant historian who specialized in World War II European history at the State University. If anyone could contextualize his father's journals and the German documents in the antechamber, it would be Rachel. Henry Dawson. She answered warmly, "I heard about your father, I'm sorry." "Thanks, Rachel. Listen, I've discovered something unusual at my father's house. I need your expertise, but it needs to stay between us for now." There was a pause on the line. "You've piqued my professional curiosity. Does this unusual discovery involve historical artifacts?" "I think it might involve a lot more than that," Henry replied. "How soon can you come to Millfield?" Rachel arrived that evening, her compact car loaded with reference materials and equipment. At 50, she carried herself with the confident energy of someone comfortable in her expertise. Her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her clothes chosen for function rather than fashion. "You've always had a flair for the dramatic, Henry," she said after he'd shown her the journal and explained about the hidden door. "But this is extraordinary even by your standards." They descended to the basement together, Max following reluctantly behind. Henry led her to the brick wall and demonstrated the hidden mechanism. Rachel watched with growing amazement as the disguised door swung open, revealing the antechamber. Beyond, "My God," she whispered, stepping into the small space. "This is... Henry, do you understand what you've found?" Henry gestured to the steel door. "Not entirely. There's more beyond that door, but I wanted you to see this first." Rachel was already examining the documents on the shelves, her expression growing increasingly serious. "These are Wehrmacht communications, engineering reports, requisition orders." She looked up, eyes wide. "Henry, these are authentic Nazi military documents from the occupation of France. How did your father get these?" "I don't know," Henry admitted. "The journal mentions someone named Ernst who provided information about what's here, but never explains who he was or how Dad knew him." Rachel continued examining the materials, her historian's training allowing her to quickly assess their significance. "Based on these documents, I'd say this Ernst was involved in something called Sonderkommando Kunzberg, a special unit tasked with confiscating cultural artifacts and valuables from occupied territories." She held up a folder containing photographs of paintings, sculptures, and other artworks, each meticulously labeled with artist, origin, and estimated value. "These are looted treasures, Henry. Art and artifacts stolen from Jewish families and museums throughout occupied Europe." Henry's stomach tightened. "Are you saying my father was some kind of Nazi collaborator?" "I don't think it's that simple," Rachel replied, still sorting through the documents. "Look at this. It's a letter dated 1974, written in English." She handed Henry a yellowed envelope containing several typewritten pages. The letter was addressed to Gerald Dawson from Ernst Weber, apparently written shortly before the latter's death. "My dear Gerald, as my health fails, I must entrust you with the burden I have carried since 1945, when I fled Germany as a young engineer. I brought with me the coordinates and access codes to Commandant Morgenstern's secret repository, not to profit from war crimes, but to ensure these treasures would someday be returned to their rightful owners. The Millfield property contains the entrance to a bunker built to exacting German specifications in 1943, unknown to American authorities. The Morgenstern family orchestrated its construction using their position in the Occupation Administration, creating a secure facility to house valuables until they could be quietly recovered after the war. I purchased the property to protect this secret, but lacked the resources to properly document and repatriate what lies within. You, with your banking, connections, and unimpeachable reputation, are the only person I trust to complete this moral obligation. The repository contains artworks, gold, and cultural artifacts valued at millions, all stolen, all waiting to be returned. The Morgenstern family has watched the property for decades, waiting for an opportunity to reclaim their ill-gotten gains. They must never succeed. With deepest respect and trust, Ernst Weber Henry looked up from the letter, meeting Rachel's equally stunned expression. The Morgensterns. Their family were Nazis? Not just any Nazis, Rachel said quietly. Based on these documents, Commandant Friedrich Morgenstern was responsible for systematic looting of Jewish properties throughout occupied France. After the war, many Nazi officials escaped to South America, but some, particularly those with specialized technical knowledge, were brought to the United States through Operation Paperclip. And they brought their stolen treasure with them, Henry finished, the pieces falling into place, hiding it here in what would become an ordinary American suburb. This is unprecedented, Rachel breathed, the historian in her already calculating the academic significance. A completely undocumented Nazi repository on American soil, intact and undisturbed for over 70 years. Henry's mind was racing with implications. And my father spent decades trying to document everything so it could be returned, while the Morgensterns tried to reclaim it through property acquisition. Your father was documenting a war crime, Henry, and based on this letter, he was doing it to ensure justice, not profit. Rachel's expression softened. Perhaps you misjudged him. The steel door now represented something far more significant than a mysterious inheritance. It was the entrance to a historical record of theft and atrocity, and possibly the means to provide long-delayed justice for victims' families. We need to see what's behind that door, Henry said, moving toward the imposing steel barrier. But first, I need to know if the Morgensterns are still watching the house. Rachel followed his gaze to the small basement windows. You think they're monitoring you? Victor Morgenstern offered well above market value with a 24-hour deadline. My brothers brought him here less than 2 days after I inherited the place. That's not coincidence, that's urgency born of opportunity. As if confirming his suspicions, headlights swept across the basement as a vehicle drove slowly past the house. Through the window, Henry caught a glimpse of a black SUV with tinted windows. We need help, Henry decided. Someone with legal expertise in historical repatriation. Rachel nodded thoughtfully. I know just the person. Daniel Levinson at the State University Center for Holocaust Studies. He spent his career helping return Nazi-looted art to descendants of the original owners. Call him, Henry said, turning back to the steel door. But first, let's see exactly what we're dealing with. Together, they approached the vault-like door. Henry gripped the wheel mechanism and, with Rachel's help, rotated it fully. The heavy door swung open with surprising smoothness, revealing a dark passageway beyond. The air that wafted out was cool and dry, preserved by sophisticated engineering that had functioned silently for 7 decades. Henry's flashlight beam penetrated the darkness, illuminating the entrance to what would prove to be the most significant discovery of his life, and a turning point in his understanding of both his father's legacy and his own purpose moving forward. Ready? he asked Rachel, who nodded with the determined expression of a historian on the verge of uncovering long-buried truths. Together, they stepped through the doorway into history, a history of theft and atrocity, but also, potentially, of long-delayed justice and redemption. Behind them, Max whined softly, as if sensing the weight of what lay ahead. The Morgenstern's black SUV circled the block again, its occupants unaware that their family's darkest secret was about to be exposed to the light of modern justice, all because of a flooded basement and an inheritance that had seemed at first glance more burden than blessing. The beam of Henry's industrial flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a sight that staggered both him and Rachel. They stood at the entrance of what could only be described as a military-grade bunker, its construction a testament to German engineering precision. The ceiling rose a full 10 feet high, supported by reinforced concrete beams. The walls, similarly fortified, bore the unmistakable characteristics of wartime German construction: functional, methodical, built to withstand bombardment. "This is impossible," Rachel whispered, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. A facility of this scale, built during wartime America, completely off the record? Henry moved his light across the room, revealing rows of metal shelving units extending into the darkness. Not completely off the record. Someone knew the Morgensterns. The bunker extended far beyond what should have been possible beneath. A suburban home, suggesting it reached well under the neighboring properties as well. As they ventured further inside, the scale of what they discovered became increasingly apparent. This wasn't merely a storage room, but a sophisticated underground complex, complete with what appeared to be living quarters, a communication center, and most significantly, a massive vault area. The engineering required to build this. Rachel marveled, running her hand along one perfectly constructed wall. The resources, the manpower, the secrecy. This would have required government-level logistics. Or Nazi efficiency, Henry countered, combined with wartime confusion. And a strategic position in the occupation administration. They approached the first set of shelving units. Unlike the antechamber's relatively modest collection of documents, these shelves held wooden crates, each labeled in precise German script with locations, dates, and catalog numbers. Rachel carefully opened one, gasping at its contents. "Henry," she breathed, lifting out a small painting in an ornate gold frame. "This is a Renoir. From the Rothschild collection in Paris. It was documented as lost during wartime activities in 1943. Henry opened another crate, finding inside a collection of silver Judaica, ritual objects from a synagogue, each piece wrapped in protective cloth. A third crate revealed ancient manuscripts, their Hebrew text still vibrant despite decades in storage. "This is systematic looting," Rachel said, her professional detachment giving way to emotional understanding. Not random theft targeted. Organized confiscation of Jewish cultural heritage. As they continued exploring, the scale of the repository became clear. One section contained dozens of paintings from renowned European masters. Another held crates of gold bullion, each bar stamped with the Reich Eagle. A third area stored jewelry, watches, and personal items, the consolidated wealth of countless families meticulously cataloged by their Nazi thieves. "The value is..." Henry couldn't complete the sentence, overwhelmed by the magnitude. "Incalculable," Rachel finished. "Monetarily, we're looking at perhaps $180 million at auction. But historically and culturally, it's beyond price. These aren't just valuable objects. They're the stolen heritage of thousands of victims." In a separate section, they discovered file cabinets containing detailed records of every item's origin. Which family it was taken from, which collection it belonged to, its estimated value. The commandant's meticulous German efficiency had unintentionally created a perfect repatriation guide, documenting the very crimes it was meant to conceal. "Your father was right," Rachel said softly. This needs to be returned to the rightful owners or their descendants. Henry nodded, still processing the weight of responsibility that had passed to him along with his inheritance. The Morgensterns have been trying to reclaim this for 3 generations. They'll fight us every step of the way. Then we need to ensure they can't, Rachel replied, her determination matching his own. They spent hours documenting their findings, photographing key items, and copying essential records. Around midnight, exhausted but resolute, they secured the vault door and returned to the main house, locking the brick entrance behind them. In the kitchen, as Rachel made coffee to help clear their minds, Henry reviewed his father's journal again with fresh understanding. The cryptic entries now made perfect sense. Gerald Dawson had spent decades secretly cataloging the repository's contents, working alone to preserve evidence of crimes the Morgenstern family desperately wanted buried. Why didn't he go public? Henry wondered aloud. With evidence this extensive, he could have exposed the whole operation decades ago. Rachel considered the question. Based on these journal entries, I'd say he was being methodical, gathering comprehensive documentation before making accusations against one of the town's most prominent families. The Morgensterns have significant influence here, don't they? Henry nodded. Victor sits on the town council. His father was mayor for 20 years. They've donated buildings to the hospital, funded the library expansion. Pillars of the community, Rachel observed. Built on a foundation of stolen wealth. Your father would have needed ironclad evidence before challenging their position. The ringing of Henry's phone interrupted their discussion. The screen showed Michael's number, despite the late hour. Henry, his brother began without preamble. Victor Morgenstern called. Said you haven't returned his calls about the offer. It's midnight, Michael, Henry replied, rubbing his tired eyes. Normal people don't conduct real estate transactions at this hour. The deadline is noon tomorrow, Michael pressed. This is a generous offer, Henry. Far more than that property is worth, especially with the flooding issues. Henry's patience, already stretched thin by the day's discoveries, finally snapped. Why are you so invested in me selling to Morgenstern specifically? There are other developers, other buyers. The silence on the line lasted a beat too long. It's just a good deal, Michael finally said, his usual confidence noticeably diminished. I'm looking out for your interests. Are you? Or are you running errands for Victor Morgenstern? Henry's suspicion had been growing since seeing his brothers arrive with the developer. What's your commission on this sale, Michael? Another telling pause. That's not fair. I'm trying to help you avoid a financial disaster. I'll handle my own disasters, thanks. And I'll make my decision about the house when I'm ready, not on Victor Morgenstern's timeline. Henry ended the call, turning to find Rachel watching him with concern. Your brothers are involved with the Morgensterns? She asked. Apparently, Henry sighed. Though I doubt they know what they're really involved with. Michael and Thomas have always been attracted to wealth and influence, the Morgensterns. Have both. Rachel's expression turned thoughtful. We need to secure this discovery legally before confronting anyone. I've texted Daniel Levinson. He's flying in tomorrow morning. As the state's leading expert on Nazi-looted art repatriation, his involvement will provide credibility and legal protection. And until then? Henry asked, glancing toward the basement door. Until then, we document everything and keep the Morgensterns away from this property. She paused, considering. They've waited decades. What suddenly lit a fire under them now? The answer came to Henry with sudden clarity. The basement flooding. It must have triggered some kind of alarm system built into the bunker. They know something's been compromised. Rachel's eyes widened with understanding. So that's why they're pushing so hard for an immediate sale. They need to secure the repository before anyone discovers it. Too late, Henry said grimly. They spent the remainder of the night taking turns keeping watch while the other rested. By dawn, both were exhausted but alert, running on coffee and the adrenaline of their discovery. Daniel Levinson arrived promptly at 8. A distinguished man in his 60s with piercing blue eyes and the deliberate movements of someone who handled priceless artifacts daily. After reviewing their initial documentation and Gerald's journal, Levinson insisted on seeing the repository himself. His reaction upon entering the main vault area was one of profound professional awe tempered by personal sadness. "In 30 years of repatriation work, I've never seen anything like this," he said, carefully examining a tagged sculpture from the shelves. Most Nazi looting was scattered after the war, items sold through Switzerland, transported to South America, hidden in various locations. But this is a comprehensive collection, preserved exactly as it was stolen. "Can it be returned to the original owners?" Henry asked. It was the question that had dominated his thoughts since their discovery. Levinson nodded slowly. "With these records? Yes, much of it can. It will take years of work, but the documentation here is remarkably complete. The Nazis were nothing if not efficient record keepers. And legally?" Rachel pressed. "The Morgensterns will claim ownership through possession, won't they?" "They can claim whatever they want," Levinson replied, his voice hardening. "But stolen property doesn't become legitimate through time alone. Under international agreements on Nazi-looted assets, these items must be returned to their rightful owners or their heirs." He turned to Henry, his expression grave but determined. "You've discovered what may be the most significant cache of Nazi-looted art and cultural heritage items found in decades. This will make international news once it becomes public." "The Morgensterns know I've inherited the property," Henry said. "They're pressing for an immediate sale. Noon today is their deadline." Levinson checked his watch. "Then we have 3 hours to secure legal protection for this site. I have contacts at the State Department's Holocaust Art Recovery Team. One call from me. With your permission, and this property will be temporarily classified as a protected historical site, preventing any sale or demolition." Henry nodded without hesitation. "Make the call." While Levinson contacted his federal connections, Henry and Rachel continued documenting the repository's contents. In a previously overlooked section, they discovered something that changed the stakes dramatically: a collection of leather-bound ledgers containing financial transactions, military communications, and most damning of all, records of the Morgenstern family's direct involvement in the confiscation of Jewish property throughout occupied France. "This isn't just about art and gold," Rachel said, carefully photographing each page. "This is evidence of war crimes. Friedrich Morgenstern wasn't just following orders. He was architect and beneficiary of a massive looting operation. And his family has been living off the proceeds ever since," Henry added, the pieces of Millfield's history rearranging themselves in his mind. The Morgenstern Development Group, the family's philanthropy, their political influence, all of it built on stolen wealth. By 11, Levinson returned with news. "It's done. The property has been granted emergency protected status, pending full investigation by federal authorities. No sale can proceed, no demolition can be approved." Henry felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "So we've stopped them. For now," Levinson cautioned. "But people like the Morgensterns don't surrender easily. Expect pushback, legal challenges, political pressure, perhaps worse." As if on cue, Henry's phone rang. Victor Morgenstern himself, no longer bothering to work through Michael as intermediary. "Mr. Dawson," Morgenstern began, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I understand there's been some unusual activity at your property. Perhaps we should meet to discuss our offer before unnecessary complications arise." "What complications would those be, Mr. Morgenstern?" Henry asked, meeting Rachel and Levinson's concerned gazes. "Regulatory complications, historical preservation challenges. Basement flooding can sometimes damage foundation elements that trigger mandatory inspections, code reviews." The threat was thinly veiled. "Actually," Henry replied, finding strength in the knowledge they'd secured. The property has just been granted protected status by the State Department's Holocaust Art Recovery Team. Any regulatory inspections would now require federal approval. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by what sounded like a sharp intake of breath. When Morgenstern spoke again, his voice had transformed from irritation to something darker. "You have no idea what you're involving yourself in. Dawson, some history is better left buried." "I disagree," Henry replied simply. "Some history demands to be brought into the light." "This isn't over," Morgenstern said before ending the call. Henry lowered the phone, meeting Levinson's steady gaze. "That sounded like a threat." "It was," Levinson confirmed. "But it's also confirmation that we're on the right track. The Morgensterns wouldn't react this strongly if we hadn't uncovered something they desperately want to keep hidden." The remainder of the day passed in a blur of activity. Federal agents arrived by mid-afternoon, establishing security around the property and beginning the painstaking process of cataloging the repository's contents. News vans gathered at the end of the street, reporters piecing together fragments of the story from neighbors' observations and official non-comments. By evening, Henry's brothers had arrived, their expressions a mixture of confusion, anger, and dawning realization that something momentous was unfolding. "What have you done?" Thomas demanded as Henry met them at the front door, federal agents visible in the background. "The Morgensterns are furious. Michael's clients are calling, demanding explanations." Henry studied his brothers' faces, searching for complicity versus ignorance. "Did you know what was under this house? Is that why you were so eager for me to sell to Morgenstern?" Michael nodded slowly, years of sibling rivalry giving way to reluctant understanding. "You were always the principled one, the honest one, even when it cost you." Henry hadn't expected this moment of reconciliation amid crisis, but he recognized its importance. "Dad and I disagreed on many things, but apparently not on matters of fundamental justice." As night fell, security tightened around the property. Levinson had warned them that the Morgensterns might attempt more direct intervention now that legal channels were closing. Henry found himself sitting on the front porch with Max beside him, watching federal agents patrol the perimeter of what had suddenly become one of the most significant historical sites in the country. Rachel joined him, offering a fresh cup of coffee. "How are you holding up?" "Still processing," Henry admitted. "Yesterday, I was a contractor with a flooded basement inheritance. Today I'm at the center of what might be the biggest Nazi art repatriation case in American history." "Your father would be proud," she said softly. "He worked his entire life toward this moment." Henry nodded, a new understanding of Gerald Dawson forming in his mind. "I spent 30 years resenting him for rejecting my choices, for being cold and distant. Now I wonder how much of that was because he was carrying this burden alone, unable to share it even with his family. He shared it with you in the end," Rachel pointed out. "Of all his children, he chose you to continue his work." The sound of approaching vehicles drew their attention. 3 black SUVs with Millfield Development Group logos turned onto the street, stopping just outside the federal perimeter. Victor Morgenstern emerged from the lead vehicle, accompanied by what appeared to be company security personnel. Henry stood, Max alert at his side. A federal agent stepped forward to intercept Morgenstern at the property line. "This is still my town," Morgenstern's voice carried clearly in the evening air. "That property has been under my family's watch for 3 generations. Whatever Dawson claims to have found there belongs to us by right of preservation." "This is now a federal investigation site, Mr. Morgenstern," the agent replied evenly. "Any claims of ownership will need to be addressed through proper legal channels." Morgenstern's gaze found Henry on the porch. "This isn't over, Dawson. You have no idea what forces you're challenging." "Actually," Henry called back, "I have a very clear idea now. The question is, do your neighbors, your business partners, your political allies know exactly what your family has been hiding all these years? The threat of exposure hung in the air between them. For decades, the Morgensterns had operated behind a veil of respectability, their dark origins buried beneath philanthropy and civic leadership. That protection was now crumbling, and Victor Morgenstern knew it. Without another word, he returned to his vehicle. The SUVs departed, but Henry harbored no illusions that the confrontation was truly over. The Morgensterns had too much to lose to surrender easily. Inside, Levinson was coordinating with his federal contacts, arranging for specialized teams to properly document and secure the repository's contents. The process would take weeks, perhaps months, but the first crucial step had been accomplished. The Nazi treasure trove was now under protection, its secrets preserved for proper historical reckoning. As midnight approached, Henry found himself drawn back to the basement, to the hidden entrance that had changed everything. The brick wall that had seemed merely unusual 2 days ago now represented a dividing line in his life, before and after discovering the truth beneath his father's house. He placed his hand on the cool brick surface, feeling a connection to Gerald Dawson that had eluded him for decades. His father had carried this burden alone, dedicating his life to documenting injustice, while knowing he might never live to see it rectified. "I understand now, Dad," Henry whispered to the empty basement. "And I'll finish what you started." The path ahead would be challenging: legal battles with the Morgensterns, the painstaking process of identifying rightful owners, the international attention that would follow once the story broke publicly. But for the first time in years, Henry felt a sense of purpose that transcended daily survival. The inheritance that his brothers had mocked, the flooded basement they dismissed as worthless, had revealed itself as something far more valuable than property or money. It was a chance to right historical wrongs, to fulfill a moral obligation decades in the making, and perhaps most unexpectedly, to understand and honor the father he'd spent most of his adult life resenting. As dawn approached, bringing with it the promise of new federal investigators, international experts, and intensified media attention, Henry finally allowed himself a few hours of rest. Tomorrow would begin the long process of bringing justice to victims whose suffering had been compounded by decades of silence and denial. The flooded basement had revealed not just hidden treasure, but hidden truth, and in doing so, had transformed Henry's inheritance from burden to purpose, from past to future, from personal grievance to universal justice. The morning sun crept through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across a scene that would have been unimaginable just 72 hours earlier. The modest suburban home had transformed into the epicenter of what government officials were now calling the most significant discovery of Nazi-looted assets on American soil. Federal agents established a command post in the living room. Holocaust art experts filled the dining room with catalogs and reference materials, and a rotating security detail patrolled the perimeter. Henry sat at his father's kitchen table, untouched coffee growing cold beside him as he watched the coordination unfold. The previous day's events had cascaded with dizzying speed. Levinson's federal contacts had escalated the discovery to the highest levels of the State Department, triggering protocols established for handling recovered Holocaust assets. By sunrise, the property had been designated a secure federal investigation site, complete with round-the-clock protection. "You need rest," Rachel said, joining him at the table. Her own exhaustion was evident, but so was the historian's gleam of excitement in her eyes. "You've barely slept in 3 days." Henry gestured to the activity around them. "Hard to rest in the middle of a federal operation." "They've got this handled for now," she insisted. "The documentation process will take weeks. You can't maintain this level of vigilance indefinitely." Before Henry could respond, Daniel Levinson entered the kitchen, accompanied by a distinguished woman in her 60s whose bearing suggested significant authority. "Henry, this is Dr. Eleanor Hoffman from the Holocaust Art Restitution Project," Levinson introduced. She's flown in from Washington to oversee the initial assessment. Dr. Hoffman extended her hand. Mr. Dawson, what you've discovered here is extraordinary. I've spent 40 years tracking looted artifacts, and I've never seen a collection this comprehensive, this well-preserved. My father deserves the credit, Henry replied, shaking her hand. He spent decades documenting everything. Yes. I've been reviewing his journals, Dr. Hoffman nodded. Gerald Dawson's meticulous work will make our task of identifying rightful owners significantly more feasible. Without his efforts, we'd be facing years of additional research. The mention of his father brought a fresh wave of complex emotions. Henry had spent half a lifetime defining himself in opposition to Gerald Dawson, rejecting the banking career, the social status, the rigid expectations. Now he found himself re-examining everything he thought he knew about the man. We've completed the initial security assessment, Dr. Hoffman continued. The repository's engineering is remarkable, German precision combined with American materials. The temperature and humidity control systems have functioned flawlessly for 70 years, preserving even the most delicate items. What happens next? Henry asked. We begin the formal documentation process, she explained. Every item photographed, measured, and matched against international databases of stolen cultural artifacts. Simultaneously, our legal team will establish clear chain of custody to protect against challenges. Challenges from the Morgensterns, Henry stated rather than asked. Dr. Hoffman's expression hardened slightly. Yes, we've already received notice of their intent to file an injunction claiming historical ownership rights. Their attorneys are arguing that Friedrich Morgenstern rescued these items during the chaos of war. Rescued, Henry repeated incredulously. From the Jewish families he helped deport to concentration camps. It's a despicable but predictable strategy, Levinson interjected. They'll attempt to reframe historical crimes as preservation efforts. Fortunately, the evidence you've discovered includes Friedrich Morgenstern's own detailed records of systematic theft, complete with valuations and Jewish ownership documentation. The conversation was interrupted by commotion at the front door. Henry rose as Michael entered the kitchen, his expression a mixture of shock and grudging respect as he took in the federal operation unfolding around him. It's all over the news, Michael said without preamble. Not specific details yet, but major historical discovery and Nazi-era artifacts are trending nationwide. Reporters are swarming the Morgenstern development offices downtown. He hesitated, then added, Thomas and I have been getting calls. The Morgenstern's legal team is pressuring everyone with connections to their businesses or investments. Pressuring how? Levinson asked sharply. Reminding them of financial entanglements, suggesting potential liability if they don't maintain appropriate discretion regarding sensitive historical matters. Michael's banker's precision with words made the threat clear. They're trying to circle the wagons, Dr. Hoffman observed. Preserve their social and financial position while they develop a legal strategy. Henry studied his brother, seeing something unfamiliar in Michael's demeanor. Uncertainty, perhaps even moral conflict. Where do you stand in all this, Michael? Michael looked around the room at the federal agents and historians now occupying his father's house, then back to Henry. I didn't know what was down there, not specifically. Victor Morgenstern approached me a year ago, said their family had historical connections to the property, suggested I facilitate a smooth transfer when Dad passed. He ran a hand through his immaculately styled hair, a rare gesture of discomfort for the usually composed banker. I assumed it was some kind of tax shelter situation. Maybe some valuable antiques the old man had stashed away. Not this. And now? Henry pressed. Michael straightened, some of his customary confidence returning. I'm a Dawson. Whatever our differences, I won't be part of covering up Nazi theft. I've already instructed my office to provide federal investigators with all correspondence from the Morgensterns regarding this property. It wasn't quite an apology, but for Michael, it represented a significant shift. Henry nodded, accepting the gesture for what it was, a first step toward reconciliation. Through shared purpose. By mid-afternoon, the situation had escalated further. News vans lined the street, held at bay by federal agents and local police. The story had broken internationally, with major networks covering what they called the Millfield discovery. Helicopter shots of the modest suburban home appeared on every channel, alongside historical footage of Nazi art theft and grainy photographs of Friedrich Morgenstern in Wehrmacht uniform. Henry watched the coverage with Rachel and Levinson, still struggling to reconcile the global significance of what lay beneath his father's house with the personal journey that had brought him here. "They'll want to interview you," Rachel said, nodding toward the media encampment. "As the property owner and Gerald's son, you're central to the story." "I'm not sure what I'd say," Henry admitted. "I'm still processing all of this myself." "You don't have to say anything yet," Levinson advised. "But eventually, your perspective will matter. This isn't just about art and gold, it's about historical truth, about confronting legacies of theft and complicity that have remained hidden for generations." A text message alert drew their attention back to Henry's phone. It was from Thomas. Emergency town council meeting called. Morgenstern pushing resolution challenging federal jurisdiction over local historical artifacts. Watch livestream, town website. They gathered around Rachel's laptop as the Millfield Town Council meeting came into view. Victor Morgenstern sat prominently at the center table, his usual smooth confidence now edged with barely controlled anger. Mayor Williams, a longtime Morgenstern ally, presided with visible discomfort. "This federal overreach threatens the very foundation of local governance," Morgenstern was saying, his voice steady despite the crisis engulfing his family. "These artifacts, whatever their origin, have been preserved in Millfield for over 70 years. They are part of our community's heritage, not Washington's." Several council members nodded in agreement, their political allegiances to the Morgenstern family evident. But then the camera panned to Thomas, who sat at the far end of the council table in his capacity as chairman of the Town Historical Preservation Committee. "The council recognizes Mr. Thomas Dawson," Mayor Williams announced reluctantly. Thomas stood, adjusting his tie in a gesture Henry recognized as his brother's preparation for confrontation. "Thank you, Mayor. I've reviewed the available information regarding the items discovered at my late father's property. I've also consulted with federal experts in Holocaust asset recovery." He paused, making eye contact with Morgenstern. "These aren't simply historical artifacts. They are stolen property, cultural treasures, and personal possessions systematically looted from Jewish families during the Holocaust. Their presence in Millfield doesn't make them ours to claim any more than keeping a stolen car for decades makes it legally yours." Morgenstern's face flushed with anger. The historical context of wartime Europe was complex. "Mr. Dawson, items were secured for preservation amid chaos and destruction. Your characterization is both legally presumptuous and historically naive." Thomas held his ground, and Henry felt unexpected pride watching his brother, the cautious, politically minded middle son, take a public moral stand. "The documentation found with these items is explicit. Mr. Morgenstern, your grandfather didn't secure these treasures. He confiscated them from families who were subsequently sent to concentration camps. The records detail values, original owners, and even which death camps they were transported to after their property was taken." A murmur ran through the council chamber. The camera caught several council members exchanging concerned glances. "I move that the Millfield Town Council formally acknowledge federal jurisdiction in this matter," Thomas continued, "and pledge full cooperation with the Holocaust Art Restitution Project's efforts to identify rightful owners." Second, called. A voice from the back of the chamber. Mayor Williams looked stricken, caught between his Morgenstern allegiance and the suddenly shifting political winds. The motion requires discussion period before. Call the vote, demanded another council member, clearly sensing which way public opinion would fall once the full story emerged. The resolution passed 7-3, with even some longtime Morgenstern allies abandoning Victor in the face of Thomas's direct moral challenge. As Victor stormed out of the chamber, the camera briefly caught his expression, not just anger, but the dawning realization that his family's carefully constructed position in Millfield society was crumbling. Henry closed the laptop, turning to find Rachel and Levinson watching him with something like admiration. "Your brothers are coming around," Rachel observed. "The Dawsons standing united," Henry mused. "Dad would be shocked." "Perhaps not," Levinson suggested. "He chose you to inherit this responsibility, but he raised all three of you with some moral compass, even if it expressed itself differently." The next morning brought new developments. The international media coverage had triggered inquiries from Holocaust survivor organizations, museums with documented losses during Nazi occupation, and families still seeking closure for art and heirlooms stolen generations earlier. Henry found himself in the unexpected role of gatekeeper, working with federal officials to manage the growing interest while preserving the integrity of the investigation. He had taken to sleeping in his father's study. The bedroom felt too personal, too intimate a space to occupy in a house he was still reconciling as both inheritance and responsibility. As he reviewed the day's security briefing with the federal team leader, Dr. Hoffman entered with urgent news. "We've identified the first clear ownership match," she announced, holding up a tablet displaying a small oil painting of a Parisian street scene. This Pissarro was stolen from the Bergman family in Lyon in 1943. The documentation is unambiguous, including Friedrich Morgenstern's personal inventory mark in the corner. "And the Bergmans?" Henry asked. Dr. Hoffman's expression softened. "Sarah Bergman survived Ravensbrück. She's 97, living in Montreal. Her granddaughter is flying in tomorrow." The reality of what they were doing, not just cataloging historical artifacts, but restoring personal connections, severed by genocide, suddenly crystallized for Henry. These weren't just valuable objects. They were pieces of family history. Thought lost forever, tangible connections to lives disrupted by unimaginable cruelty. "I'd like to be there," he said quietly, "when the painting is returned." "Of course," Dr. Hoffman agreed. "It would be appropriate. Your father's work made this moment possible." Later that day, as Henry helped Rachel organize a filing system for the growing documentation, a commotion at the security perimeter drew their attention. Through the window, they saw Victor Morgenstern engaged in heated discussion with federal agents waving legal documents. Levinson joined them, his expression grim. He served federal notice challenging the seizure of what he terms Morgenstern family historical artifacts. His legal team is arguing that Friedrich Morgenstern acted as a private citizen, not a Nazi official, in acquiring these items. "That's absurd," Rachel protested. "The documentation explicitly shows he was acting under official capacity as commandant." "It's a delay tactic," Levinson explained. "They can't win on the merits, but they can create procedural obstacles, tie things up in court while they move assets, adjust their financial positions, and manage public perception." Henry watched Victor Morgenstern retreat to his waiting car, shoulders rigid with anger. He still thinks he can control this narrative, doesn't he? That his family's position is salvageable. "Wealth and privilege create powerful illusions of invulnerability," Levinson observed. 3 generations of Morgensterns have maintained their position through that illusion. It doesn't dissolve easily. The confrontation proved to be merely the opening salvo in the Morgensterns' counteroffensive. By evening, they had filed emergency motions in 3 different courts, dispatched a public relations team to offer historical context to local media, and most troublingly, begun reaching out to certain federal officials with whom they had long-standing connections. They're calling in every favor, leveraging every relationship, Dr. Hoffman reported during their evening briefing. We've received inquiries from 2 congressional offices suggesting we might be overreaching in our jurisdiction. Can they actually impede the process? Henry asked. They can complicate it, she acknowledged. But the evidence is too compelling. The moral imperative's too clear. They might delay justice, but they won't prevent it. The next morning, Henry awoke to find Thomas in the kitchen, making coffee with the precise movements of someone accustomed to routine in all things. Thought you could use reinforcements, Thomas explained, handing Henry a cup. Michael's handling some financial matters related to Dad's estate, but he'll be by later. Henry accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. The Morgensterns reaching out to you directly yet? 3 calls yesterday, Thomas confirmed. First offering support for my difficult family situation, then suggesting the political advantages of a moderate position, acknowledging complex historical nuances, and finally implying that my position on certain municipal development projects might be reconsidered if I didn't exacerbate community tensions. Threats, Henry translated. Increasingly explicit ones, Thomas agreed. They don't understand that every threat only confirms the moral necessity of standing against them. The brothers' conversation was interrupted by Rachel's excited entrance. They found something new, she announced, gesturing for them to follow her to the basement. In the repository's communications section, Dr. Hoffman and a team of researchers huddled around a metal filing cabinet they'd just unsealed. Inside were hundreds of letters, official dispatches, and personal correspondence belonging to Friedrich Morgenstern. These appear to be Morgenstern's private communications, Dr. Hoffman explained, carefully handling a folder of yellowed papers, including his correspondence with certain American officials after the war, arranging his immigration and placement. Operation Paperclip, Rachel clarified, seeing Henry's questioning look. The program that brought German scientists and technical experts to America after the war, often overlooking their Nazi connections in exchange for their knowledge. But Friedrich Morgenstern wasn't a scientist, Thomas pointed out. He was a military administrator. Exactly, Dr. Hoffman said meaningfully. Which raises the question of why he received preferential placement, complete with American sponsors willing to vouch for him, despite his SS background. She handed Henry a letter bearing official U.S. Army letterhead from 1946. This may provide some answers. The letter, addressed to immigration authorities, described Friedrich Morgenstern as a valuable intelligence asset with specialized knowledge of Soviet capabilities and urged expedited processing of his citizenship application. It was signed by Colonel James Harrington, U.S. Army Intelligence. Harrington, Thomas repeated, recognition dawning. As in Harrington Steel, the defense contractor? Dr. Hoffman nodded grimly, the very same. It appears the Morgenstern family's rapid rise in American society wasn't merely the result of hidden Nazi treasure. They had powerful sponsors who helped establish them here, possibly in exchange for access to that treasure. A conspiracy that extended beyond the Morgensterns, Henry realized. Involving American officials, corporations, a network of complicity, Rachel confirmed. And these documents name names, detail arrangements, specify exactly who helped the Morgensterns establish themselves in Millfield while burying their Nazi past. The implications were staggering. Beyond the stolen art and gold lay a deeper story of post-war moral compromise, of American institutions and individuals willing to overlook genocide for financial or strategic advantage. This goes beyond art restitution, Levinson said, joining their discussion. These documents reveal a pattern of institutional complicity that continued well into the Cold War era. Some of the corporations mentioned still exist, still hold defense contracts. Will this be made public too? Henry asked. It must be, Dr. Hoffman replied firmly. Historical truth requires full disclosure, however uncomfortable. The families seeking justice deserve to know the complete story of what happened to their stolen heritage, including who facilitated its concealment for 7 decades. By noon, the Morgensterns had escalated their response, filing a federal lawsuit naming Henry personally, alleging trespassing, conversion of property, and defamation. The family's attorneys delivered notice directly to the house, pushing past reporters to serve Henry with papers. "It's purely intimidation," Levinson assured him after reviewing the complaint. "They have no legal standing, but they're hoping to pressure you personally while they fight the federal action on procedural grounds." Henry accepted the assessment with unexpected calm. 3 days earlier, such a lawsuit would have terrified him, a contractor of modest means facing a wealthy family's legal onslaught. Now it seemed almost predictable, even necessary, the dying gasp of a corrupt legacy finally exposed to light. "Let them come after me," he said simply. "Every legal action they take only draws more attention to what we found here." That afternoon, as promised, Sarah Bergman's granddaughter Elise arrived from Montreal. A composed woman in her 40s. She carried with her a folder of pre-war family photographs showing the Pizarro painting hanging in her grandparents' Lyon apartment. "My grandmother never expected to see this again," she explained as they gathered in the dining room, the small painting carefully displayed on an easel prepared by the conservation team. After the war, she tried filing claims, but without specific provenance documentation, it was impossible to trace. "Your grandmother's name is right here," Rachel said gently, showing her the original Nazi inventory document with Bergman Ss. Lyon clearly noted beside the painting's entry. Friedrich Morgenstern's men took detailed records of everything they stole. Elise touched the document reverently, her fingers tracing her grandmother's name. The meticulous evil of it all, they documented their own crimes so thoroughly. And in doing so, made this moment of return possible, Dr. Hoffman noted. Historical justice often comes through unexpected channels. When the formal restitution paperwork was completed, Henry handed this small painting to Elise personally. "Your grandmother's patience has been vindicated," he said quietly. "Please tell her that my father spent decades working to make this moment possible." Elise accepted the painting with tears in her eyes. "This isn't just art returning home," she said. "It's a piece of my grandmother's life she thought was lost forever." The Nazis didn't just take possessions. They took history, identity, connection to the past. Today, we've reclaimed a small piece of that. As she departed with the painting secured in a special transport case, reporters captured the moment for the evening news, the first tangible result of the Millfield discovery, the first family to receive justice after 7 decades of waiting. That night, alone in his father's study after the day's whirlwind of activities, Henry found himself drawn to Gerald Dawson's personal desk. Unlike the meticulous journals documenting the repository, this drawer contained more personal items, photographs, letters, mementos of a life Henry had largely avoided engaging with. Among them, he found a photograph he'd never seen before, Gerald, much younger, standing beside an elderly man Henry didn't recognize. On the back, in his father's precise handwriting, with Ernst Weber, 1975, "The burden passes." Henry studied the image, seeing in his father's solemn expression the weight of the responsibility he had accepted, a burden he would carry silently for decades, even at the cost of his relationship with his youngest son. "I didn't understand you, Dad," Henry said to the empty room. "But I'm starting to." Outside, federal agents maintained their vigilant perimeter around the property. In downtown Millfield, the Morgensterns undoubtedly plotted their next legal maneuver. Across the world, Holocaust survivor families following the unfolding story dared to hope that items long thought lost might finally return home. And in a modest suburban house with a once-flooded basement, Henry Dawson continued the work his father had begun, transforming an inheritance of secrets into a legacy of justice. The international media dubbed it the Millfield Miracle, a phrase that captured both the extraordinary nature of the discovery and the almost providential timing. As the documentation process entered its second week, the significance of Gerald Dawson's meticulous work became increasingly apparent. Many similar collections of Nazi-looted assets recovered in the decades after World War II had presented nearly insurmountable challenges for restitution efforts due to incomplete or destroyed records. But the repository beneath Henry's inherited home was different. A perfectly preserved time capsule with intact documentation, connecting nearly every item to its rightful owner. "Your father created something unprecedented here," Dr. Hoffman explained during their morning briefing. Not just preservation of the physical items, but a comprehensive restitution roadmap. He cross-referenced original Nazi inventory numbers with deportation records, post-war survivor registries, and family genealogies. For items where direct heirs couldn't be identified, he documented the museums or cultural institutions they were stolen from. He was building a case, Rachel added, her admiration evident, gathering evidence that would be unassailable when finally presented. Henry nodded, still reconciling this image of his father, the patient, methodical pursuer of historical justice, with the stern banker he'd rebelled against in his youth. Why didn't he come forward sooner? Why wait decades? Dr. Hoffman considered the question thoughtfully. Based on his journals, I believe he understood the power dynamics he was challenging. The Morgenstern's influence was at its peak during the 1970s and 80s, with connections extending to federal levels. He needed absolute documentation, unimpeachable evidence, and perhaps most crucially, the right moment when that evidence could not be buried or dismissed. He was waiting for the world to be ready to hear the truth, Thomas suggested, joining their conversation. For a time when Holocaust restitution had established legal precedents and institutional support, and for the Morgenstern's power to begin waning, Michael added from the doorway, his banker's analysis cutting to pragmatic realities. Their influence has declined significantly in the past decade. The third generation hasn't maintained the political connections Friedrich and Richard cultivated so carefully. The brothers exchanged glances, a newfound respect emerging from their shared purpose. Whatever their differences with their father, and with each other, they now stood united in completing Gerald Dawson's mission. The day brought a new dimension to the unfolding story. Federal investigators had expanded their inquiry beyond the repository itself to the broader question of how Nazi war criminals had established themselves in post-war America with apparent ease. The documents found in Friedrich Morgenstern's private files had opened a Pandora's box of historical complicity involving prominent American companies, military officials, and political figures. The Congressional Oversight Committee has scheduled hearings for next month, Levinson reported, ending a call with his Washington contacts. Several major corporations named in Morgenstern's files are already issuing statements, distancing themselves from historical associations they were unaware of. 70 years of plausible deniability coming to an end, Rachel observed. A knock at the front door interrupted their discussion. A federal agent escorted in an unexpected visitor, Eleanor Keller, the longtime society editor of the Millfield Gazette and unofficial town historian. In her 80s now, Eleanor had documented the community's social dynamics for over 50 years. Her weekly column, a chronicle of Millfield's evolving power structure. "I've been watching the coverage," she explained after introductions, "and I believe I have information that might be relevant to your investigation." Henry invited her to sit, intrigued by what this witness to decades of Millfield history might contribute. Eleanor removed a small leather journal from her handbag, its pages worn with age. "This belonged to my father, Robert Keller. He was town clerk when the Morgensterns arrived in 1946. She opened the journal carefully. My father was a meticulous observer. He documented things the official town records wouldn't capture: the private meetings, the unexplained changes in zoning, the sudden shifts in business ownership. She handed the journal to Dr. Hoffman, who examined it with professional interest. These appear to be contemporary observations of the Morgensterns' integration into Millfield society. And the resistance they encountered, Eleanor added. Not everyone welcomed them with open arms. There were questions, suspicions about their sudden wealth, their European connections. Henry leaned forward. What happened to those who raised questions? Eleanor's expression turned somber. They encountered difficulties. Business loans suddenly recalled. Tax audits. Zoning permits denied. By 1950, anyone who had publicly questioned the Morgensterns' background found themselves either marginalized or driven from Millfield entirely. Systematic elimination of opposition, Rachel murmured. Using American systems to continue the methods they'd perfected in occupied Europe. My father recognized the pattern, Eleanor confirmed. He'd served in Army intelligence during the war, seen the Nazi administrative approach firsthand. But he had a family to protect, so he documented quietly, hoping the record would matter someday. She met Henry's gaze directly, rather like your father did, decades later. The parallel wasn't lost on Henry, two men separated by time, but united in their recognition of injustice and their patient documentation for some future reckoning. It suggested a continuing thread of resistance running beneath Millfield's placid surface, a counter-narrative to the Morgensterns' carefully constructed public image. Would you be willing to share your father's observations with our investigators? Dr. Hoffman asked. They provide valuable social context for the Morgensterns' establishment in America. That's why I'm here, Eleanor replied simply. Some truths take generations to emerge. When they do, those who preserve them must step forward. Her visit represented the beginning of a new phase in the investigation. Millfield residents coming forward with long-suppressed knowledge, fragments of the larger story that had remained hidden for decades. By week's end, the federal team had collected testimonies from over 24 longtime residents, each contributing pieces to the mosaic of the Morgensterns' true history in America. Meanwhile, the repository continued yielding its secrets. Beyond the extensively documented art and cultural artifacts, investigators discovered financial records detailing how Friedrich Morgenstern had laundered Nazi assets through Swiss banks and South American intermediaries before establishing legitimate-seeming business interests in the United States. He essentially created a blueprint for how Nazi wealth was hidden after the war, the Treasury Department's representative explained during their afternoon briefing. These records may help track similar assets in dozens of other cases. For Henry, the revelations continued on a more personal level as well. In his father's study, he discovered correspondence between Gerald and Ernst Weber spanning nearly 20 years, letters that revealed a deep friendship born of shared purpose and moral clarity. April 17, 1980. My dear Gerald, your latest progress report gives me hope that our work will not be in vain. While my health continues to decline, I find comfort knowing you have taken up this burden with such dedication. When I purchased that house in 1950, I could not have imagined the perfect partner I would find in you decades later. The Morgensterns continue their facade of respectability, building their American dynasty on the foundation of stolen lives. Richard's son Victor shows the same ruthless ambition as his father and grandfather. Yet I sense their vulnerability. Each generation moves further from direct knowledge of what lies beneath your house, relying more on myth than memory. Document everything, my friend. Truth is patient. It waits for its moment, preserving its strength while lies grow brittle with age. With gratitude and hope, Ernst. The letter offered Henry new insight into his father's mission, not a solitary obsession but a partnership, a responsibility passed from one generation to another. Ernst had identified Gerald as someone with both the means and moral clarity to continue his work, just as Gerald had ultimately selected Henry to complete what they had begun. "He chose you because you were different from him," Rachel observed when Henry shared the correspondence. "Not despite it." "What do you mean?" Henry asked. "Your brothers followed the path of least resistance: banking, finance, established systems. You challenged conventions, chose your own way despite the cost." She smiled softly. Gerald needed someone who would stand firm against pressure, who would value justice above social position or financial gain. It was a perspective Henry had never considered, that his rejection of his father's world might have been precisely what qualified him for this inheritance. The thought created a bridge across decades of estrangement, connecting him to Gerald Dawson in a way that transcended their differences. As the second week drew to a close, the Morgensterns mounted what media described as their legal counteroffensive. Teams of attorneys filed motions in multiple jurisdictions, challenging federal authority, asserting historical preservation claims, and most desperately, attempting to reframe Friedrich Morgenstern as a cultural preserver who had rescued artistic treasures from wartime destruction. The narrative found little traction in a world where Holocaust education had firmly established the reality of Nazi looting. Each legal maneuver seemed only to highlight the family's increasing desperation as their carefully constructed century of lies unraveled in real time, broadcast across global media platforms. Victor Morgenstern himself had retreated from public view, his company issuing statements through attorneys, while he reportedly sought treatment for stress-related health concerns at a private facility in Arizona. The carefully cultivated Morgenstern legacy, philanthropists, civic leaders, pillars of the community, was crumbling with each new revelation. "They're liquidating assets," Michael reported during the family's evening strategy session. "My banking contacts say they're moving millions offshore, preparing for what they must now see as inevitable criminal charges, civil liability, complete financial exposure." "Too late," Thomas added. "Federal agencies have already frozen their primary accounts pending investigation. The Massachusetts Attorney General is preparing charges related to decades of tax fraud, concealing the origins of their wealth." Henry listened to his brother's analysis with a sense of somber satisfaction. The machinery of justice was finally engaging, decades later than it should have, but with a thoroughness that would leave no aspect of the Morgensterns' crimes unexamined. The third week brought the first formal repatriation ceremony, held in the Millfield Community Center with international media in attendance. 5 families, descendants of Holocaust victims from France, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, received artworks and personal items stolen from their ancestors. The emotional ceremony, with Henry representing the Dawson family alongside federal officials, put human faces to the abstract concept of historical justice. Judith Kleinman, accepting a silver Kiddush cup that had belonged to her grandfather, spoke words that resonated deeply with everyone present. "The Nazis tried to erase us twice, first by taking our lives, then by taking the evidence we ever existed. Today, we reclaim not just objects, but our place in history. Our family story continues because these precious items have returned home." Later that evening, as Henry walked through the repository with Rachel, the shelves already showing gaps where returned items had been, he felt a profound sense of purpose that transcended the initial shock of discovery. "We've identified nearly 60% of the items already," Rachel noted, consulting her tablet. "At this rate, we should be able to connect most of the collection with rightful owners or their descendants within 6 months." "And the remainder?" Henry asked. "Items without clear heirs will go to cultural heritage institutions, museums with specialized Holocaust collections, educational foundations, memorial sites." She paused, considering. "Your father actually left detailed recommendations for each category." Henry smiled at this final evidence of Gerald Dawson's thoroughness, planning not just for the items that could be returned directly, but for those that would need to serve broader purposes of remembrance and education. As they completed their evening assessment, a federal agent approached with urgent news. "We've just received word. Victor Morgenstern was apprehended attempting to cross into Canada with falsified documents. Customs found him carrying over $2 million in bearer bonds and several storage device passwords that likely connect to additional hidden assets." The desperate flight attempt represented the final collapse of the Morgenstern facade, the public mask of legitimacy discarded in favor of naked self-preservation. By morning, the story dominated headlines nationwide, with legal experts predicting a cascade of criminal charges spanning multiple jurisdictions. 1 month after Henry had first ascended into his father's flooded basement, he found himself addressing an international symposium on Holocaust asset recovery hosted by the State Department. Seated alongside Dr. Hoffman, Levinson, and representatives from global restitution organizations, he shared the story of his inheritance and its transformation from burden to mission. "My father spent 30 years documenting what lay beneath his house," he told the assembled experts and media. "Not for financial gain, not for recognition, but because he understood that time does not diminish the need for justice. He taught me, through his actions more than his words, that some responsibilities transcend personal convenience or comfort." Henry paused, finding Michael and Thomas in the audience, their expressions reflecting a newfound respect that had replaced decades of condescension. What began as a flooded basement became a channel for long-delayed justice, a means for reconnecting families with their stolen heritage, and ultimately, a reckoning with historical truths too long buried. The symposium marked a turning point in how the Millfield discovery would be understood historically, not merely as a remarkable cache of Nazi-looted assets, but as a case study in the patient pursuit of justice across generations. The methodical work of Ernst Weber and Gerald Dawson, culminating in Henry's stewardship of their legacy, offered a template for addressing other instances of historical injustice where truth had been buried by power and privilege. In the months that followed, the Millfield repository yielded over 800 individual restitutions, artworks, religious artifacts, family heirlooms, and personal treasures returning to descendants across 4 continents. Each return represented not just material restoration, but a reclaiming of family narrative, a healing of historical wounds that had remained open for generations. The Morgenstern case moved through legal systems with the deliberate pace of significant prosecutions. Victor faced charges ranging from tax evasion to possession of stolen property to conspiracy to obstruct justice. The family's corporate entities underwent forensic accounting that revealed decades of financial manipulation designed to launder the origins of their wealth. Their charitable foundations, stripped of assets, were dissolved and reconstituted under court supervision to support Holocaust education and remembrance. For Henry, the transformation extended beyond the public mission to his personal understanding of family and legacy. The brothers who had once mocked his inheritance now worked alongside him, Michael applying his financial expertise to tracing Nazi assets through complex international channels, Thomas leveraging his political connections to support legislative reforms addressing historical asset repatriation. 1 year after the discovery, Henry stood in what had once been his father's flooded basement, now restored and transformed into a small memorial space documenting both the Nazi looting operation and the 3-generation effort to expose it. A plaque near the entrance read simply, "In memory of Ernst Weber and Gerald Dawson, who preserved truth when others buried it." Rachel joined him, their relationship having evolved from professional collaboration to something deeper during their shared mission. "The last of the identified items goes home next week," she said, checking her notes. The Bergman family's silver menorah, returning to Sarah's great-grandchildren in Israel. Henry nodded, a sense of completion settling over him. "And the repository itself?" "The State Department proposal seems most appropriate," Rachel replied. "Converting this space into a permanent educational site, teaching future generations about both the theft and the 7-decade journey toward justice. The transformation of the Dawson property into a living museum would ensure that the story continued beyond the physical return of the stolen items. Visitors would learn not just about Nazi looting, but about the patient resistance that had preserved evidence of these crimes until justice became possible. A lesson in moral perseverance with relevance beyond this specific historical context. As they climbed the stairs to the main house, Henry's thoughts returned to that first day, standing in floodwater, resentful of an unexpected inheritance, unaware of the purpose that awaited him. The house that had seemed a burden had become a vehicle for meaning far beyond anything he could have imagined. In the kitchen, he found Michael and Thomas reviewing plans for the Gerald Dawson Foundation, a new initiative they had jointly created to support Holocaust education and asset recovery efforts worldwide. The brothers, who had once been distant competitors, now collaborated with the ease of those united by shared purpose rather than divided by old grievances. "The first research grants go out next month," Michael explained, his financial precision now directed toward constructive ends. 6 universities, 3 memorial institutions, focusing on underexplored aspects of Nazi asset confiscation in Eastern Europe. "And the congressional testimony is confirmed for Thursday," Thomas added. "They're particularly interested in our recommendations for reforming historical asset legislation." Henry smiled at this evidence of transformation, not just of the basement's contents or the Morgenstern's legacy, but of his own family's reconnection through shared purpose. The inheritance that his brothers had once mocked had ultimately provided a mission that engaged all their respective talents, bringing them together in ways Gerald might never have anticipated, but would surely have approved. That evening, alone, in what had been his father's study, Henry completed his own contribution to the family legacy, a comprehensive narrative of the Millfield discovery from his unique perspective. Not merely a historical account, but a personal reflection on how an unexpected inheritance had revealed generations of hidden purpose. He ended the manuscript with words that captured the journey from flooded basement to global reckoning. "My father left me a house with water in the basement and history beneath the water. In addressing the first problem, I discovered the second, and in that discovery, found not just purpose but connection across time." Ernst Weber preserved evidence of crimes when others sought to bury it. Gerald Dawson documented that evidence when others would have destroyed it. "I inherited not just their work, but their understanding that justice sometimes requires patience, measured not in days or months, but in decades or even generations." The flooded basement that my brothers laughed at has yielded not just Nazi treasure, but something far more valuable: the opportunity to restore historical truth, to reconnect families with their stolen heritage, and perhaps most unexpectedly, to reconcile my own family through shared purpose. Some inheritances come with responsibility beyond their apparent value. Some burdens reveal themselves as unexpected blessings, and some journeys that begin in flooded basements lead to healing that extends far beyond the foundations of a single house. 3 years after Henry Dawson reluctantly accepted his father's seemingly worthless inheritance, the Millfield Repository Educational Center welcomed its 10,000th visitor. The modest suburban house had become an internationally recognized site for Holocaust education, a testament to how ordinary places can sometimes harbor extraordinary history. Victor Morgenstern, convicted on multiple federal charges, served his sentence at a minimum security facility in Pennsylvania, his family's century of influence reduced to a cautionary footnote in Millfield's revised historical narrative. The Morgenstern fortune, largely seized through asset forfeiture, had been redirected toward Holocaust survivor support programs, a fitting transformation of wealth built on theft and deception. For Henry, the journey had come full circle. The contractor who once specialized in rebuilding physical structures had ultimately helped rebuild historical truth, family connections, and justice delayed by decades. The flooded basement that had seemed a burden had revealed itself as the foundation for meaning beyond anything he could have imagined. As he guided a group of high school students through the repository's educational exhibits, explaining both the Nazi looting operation and the three-generation effort to document and expose it, one teenager asked the question visitors frequently posed: "Weren't you tempted to keep some of it? I mean, legally it was on your property." Henry smiled, understanding the question came not from mercenary instinct, but from genuine curiosity about human nature confronted with unexpected wealth. "The items in this repository were never mine to keep," he explained. "They were stolen from families who had already lost everything else to Nazi persecution. My inheritance wasn't the gold or the artworks. It was the responsibility to return them." The distinction represented the heart of what Henry had learned through his unexpected journey, that some inheritances carry moral obligations that transcend conventional notions of ownership or value. The flooded basement his brothers had mocked had ultimately revealed not just hidden treasure, but hidden purpose, transforming burden into meaning, coincidence into calling, and a fractured family into partners in long-delayed justice. As the students moved to the next exhibit, Henry paused before the photographs of Ernst Weber and Gerald Dawson that now hung prominently in the memorial space, two ordinary men who had demonstrated extraordinary moral perseverance across decades of patient documentation and waiting. The inheritance they had passed to him extended far beyond property or possessions to something far more valuable: the understanding that some truths require guardians willing to preserve them until the world is ready to hear them. The flooded basement had revealed its true value not in Nazi gold, but in the opportunity to complete a mission spanning 3 generations, a reminder that sometimes what appears to be disaster may actually be destiny in disguise, waiting for someone willing to dig deeper beneath the surface of apparent misfortune, to discover purpose that transforms not just personal circumstance, but historical understanding. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.